having started with a spiritual exercise, it's my very first quotation, and how I'd like to start is a quote from Shantananda Saraswati that is in the Good Company, Volume 2, in which he says, the spiritual world is concerned with only one subject, freedom and appreciation of unchanging truth. And I've added, economic justice is required to enable the material needs of all people, that all people have, to be met, so that as many as possible are free to meet their own higher needs and humankind's true purpose. And I've added the last piece, humankind's true purpose, on an assumption that we are here in this world for some reason. We may not know what that reason is, but along with everything else that is produced by man, it is produced, when conscious, for a purpose. So the presumption here is that economic justice is required not only to meet the material needs that all people have, because if those needs are not being met, attention is invariably distracted from any higher need that people do have. But I've added the piece about their own higher needs and humankind's true purpose in recognition of the very simple fact that man is a social creature, that everything that we do and our whole lives revolve around interacting with other people. And indeed, it is a peculiar feature of the human species that we have this social aspect, but it's only peculiar insofar as that social aspect of human nature is combined with another extraordinarily important and unique feature. It's the feature that we would call, in philosophical terms, the inner instrument, as distinct from the outer instrument of our senses, our ability to see, to hear, to taste, to touch, to smell. But our inner instrument, some of us will be familiar with the word antakarana, is more subtle, finer. And it's that subtle fineness that has enabled human beings to become dominant, the dominant species on our planet. It is not just that we can think, but that we can devise ways of satisfying our desires by all sorts of different systems. Compared with almost any other animal, or many other animals anyway, we're slower, weaker, not so sharp in all our sensory perceptors as many other creatures. But this area, this capacity to think, to reason, to will, and then adjust our actions in accordance with that will, makes us unique. But it's not unique as an individual. The uniqueness and the power of humankind comes from our ability to cooperate, to work together. And working together happens in two distinct ways, one might say. First of all, we can conjoin and engage in the same activity. Pulling on a rope together more than increases our strength. In fact, the image of a rugby scrum comes to mind. But I suppose if I was to stay with the rugby analogy, there are different parts, there are different positions, there are different roles. And I always find it quite extraordinary to see a rugby match, even at the very top level, to see some of the tallest, heaviest, boldest, strongest chaps alongside others that are quite small and swift and agile. And they each have a part. And the role is, in a game of rugby, for example, and I didn't know I was going to go there when I started, but now I've started, I better finish. The object of the game is for the team to win. And that's what I meant when I kicked off by saying humankind's true purpose. Our spiritual work may not enable too many of us individually to become fully realized. I say that with tongue in cheek. Too many, any, who knows? But we've all been playing this game for long enough to know the challenge there. But we do not know what impact our individual effort has on the whole work. And certainly we can regard this in relation to the whole activities of the School of Philosophy and Economic Science. We each contribute our individual bits in a particular way. And the real aim is for the school to succeed alongside individual advancement. So I'll just repeat what I said right at the beginning, that the spiritual world is concerned with only one subject, freedom and appreciation of unchanging truth. And economics complements that, is needed for that, because economic justice is required to enable the material needs that all people have. And we are bound to acknowledge we are embodied. We are not disembodied spirits, we are embodied spirits. And those material needs have to be met in one way or another. But not just to be met individually, but so that as many people as possible are free to meet not only their own higher needs, but humankind's true purpose. So that's, if you like, the first idea. And that's what we're concerned with any of our studies. We are bound to resort to ideas. But our ideas in relation to economics in particular, and certainly to the science of political economy, needs to be structured in some way. We need to have a system, and our ideas are expressed in words. And one of the difficulties associated with the study of political economy is that the language we use in English is common language. If we were engaged in any number of other sciences, for example, chemistry, we would learn the specific words having specific meanings and no other meanings. So most scientists, or sciences I should say, have a language of their own and are not then prone to confusion. But unfortunately, the language that is used in the science of political economy is common. We use all sorts of words, such as land, value, wealth, labour, capital. Words which are in common parlance, and everybody has an idea as to what they mean. And in the same way that to pick up a science, such as astronomy or chemistry or whatever, then we will pursue that in and when we speak to each other about it, using language, there is not the scope for confusion. There's no other uses of the word element or molecule, for example, that enables us to confuse. But when we're speaking about the science of political economy, those words do have a common meaning. And whilst few of us would profess to be scientists in relation to a particular science, most of us have opinions about the world of economics, as to why prices are as they are, as to why there is unemployment, as to what the cause of the housing crisis is, as to what happens to taxes, and that we all are likely to have a view on it. In fact, we are bombarded every day through the media with a plethora of opinions, theories, beliefs with regard to the world of economic affairs. So if we are to adopt a scientific approach to this, then we need to be clear of our terms, of our language. And I say to be scientific as distinct from opinion. And the very basis of the school's approach to economics has always been that the world that we perceive, that we know, is governed by law, by laws of nature. Laws that are beyond human control, that cannot be disobeyed without consequence. So central to both our philosophy, in which we are concerned to discover the laws that relate to human beings, and economics, which is concerned to discover the laws that govern the nature of society. And many of you will know that that was the book, that was the title of the book that Mr. Leon McLaren, the founder of the school, wrote on economics, the nature of society. So let's start, though, by looking at the nature of an individual human being from a material standpoint. Very simply, that we have material needs. We need space. We need air. We need food. We need water. We can't survive without any of these things. Man, as a land creature, is terrestrial. We need land. We have to occupy land. And this leads to really a very simple situation, or the fundamental, I guess, the law that maybe we need to first of all acknowledge is that man's actions are governed by desire. But not only, and that desire may be fed by need, but it may not. It may be just fed by desire, by a particular inclination. There is no need for this chocolate, but I desire it, and so I set out to get it, or whatever. But a point that George draws attention to, and that is important for us to mark, is that people seek to satisfy their desires with the minimum of exertion. We are, as it were, by nature, seek to be efficient. Now, that's not to say that we're greedy or that we're selfish, because it doesn't matter whether that desire is worthy, virtuous, or vicious and selfish. Whatever the desire, men seek to gratify it with the minimum of exertion. And here I've slipped into the sexist men, and I apologise for that, because I suspect that ladies seek to gratify their desires equally with the minimum of exertion. But of course, that doesn't say what the desire is. And of course, we may simply desire exercise, but even there, it's the gratification of the result of the exercise that is being sought. So it's gratification of the desire that is really being sought. So that's another idea, that people seek to gratify their desires with the minimum of exertion. And couple that now with this ability to cooperate, as I mentioned before, and the way in which people intelligently cooperate. And what we're led to then is to an appreciation that we can best achieve our ends by measures of specialization. We are all different. Here we are looking at whatever it is, 8, 11 different faces, well, and one landscape. But and we're all clearly different. And then we have different talents and different abilities. And so you wouldn't expect us all to specialize in the same thing. But if we specialize and get satisfaction from what we're particularly well equipped to do, we all win. So the development of society relies upon and is a fruit of this cooperation, this tendency to specialize and yes, to specialize. And the thing that I should then mark in relation to this is the intelligence of human beings that's given rise to this tendency to trade, to exchange. And it's worth remembering that the exchange process itself is productive of adding value. More satisfaction is achieved when I exchange something that I value less with you who value what I have more highly. So in every voluntary exchange, there is a win-win situation in which new value is added. So the very process of trading, of exchanging, is part and parcel of economic production. So those are really remarks setting the scene for a very large extent. So what we've discovered is, and what we've highlighted anyway thus far, is that man is a terrestrial creature. He's a land animal. That no two people can occupy the same place at the same time. So, because no two people can occupy the same space at the same time, when any one is granted exclusive occupancy of a particular place, and they are bound to need that, we can't both sleep in the same place at the same time. What we might mark here is that this space, in fact, it's sometimes referred to, and I've seen it referred to by Shankaracharya, as the self is similar to space, insofar as it permeates everything and contains everything. That one thing, space, is in everything and contains everything, in much the same way as this self, this consciousness, this Brahman, whatever word you happen to use to cover that which is one, that permeates and contains everything, which we call self, or in other names, is reflected in the material world through space. So this unique character gives rise now to a primary economic phenomenon, a phenomenon known as rent. And the rent arises whenever two or more people wish to occupy the same place at the same time. And I did have bear with me just for a minute, because I did want to make a quote from something that I wrote earlier. No, I can't, because I can't find it. No, okay, let's pause there then for a minute and see what comments or observations you have with regard to what's been said so far, before I get into the nitty-gritty of rent and its necessity to share it. Anything arising from what's been said thus far? Anything recognisable from what's been said thus far? Anything that wasn't interesting or was interesting about what's been said thus far?
Well, I think that the seek to satisfy with minimum effort lays the ground for exploitation of our fellow man. That seems to be, you can fulfill a lot of your desires if you subjugate your fellow man, which is working at the material level, I know. So in that sort of perhaps ignorance, we might call it, but so raising that level of awareness or about the shared heritage of the you know, this earth that we share, etc., and that if we don't cooperate and work together, then it will be bad for everyone. But it seems to me one of the major challenges for economics is for people to realize their common human heritage, and to stand up for that. So perhaps we'll move on a bit to that, but that is one of the areas of exploitation of one person by another.
Okay, yes, it is. And just as I said, this propensity or tendency of human beings to gratify their desires with the minimum exertion is common as to whether that desire is worthy or unworthy. But does anybody have any difficulty with that idea? The recognition that that is the case, that we seek to gratify our desires with the minimum of exertion, because it has all sorts of implications. So it will be interesting to know if anybody has a problem with that very idea, because it's a fairly central idea that governs almost all economic behavior, that we seek to gratify our desires with the minimum of exertion. Then, of course, that does forces you to the question, what's the quality of the desire? What's the nature of the desire? And that then brings you to an appreciation of the of what it is to be a human being and a member of the human race, of a society and the like. Anything else at this point? Okay, what I'm going to do now then is to start to develop some of these words. And I'm going to kick that off with a quotation from Marcus Aurelius Antonius that Henry George uses at the very beginning of his opus magnum, Progress and Poverty. And Marcus Aurelius said, "Make for thyself a definition or description of the thing which is presented to thee, so as to see distinctly what kind of a thing it is, in its substance, in its nudity, in its complete entirety, and tell thyself its proper name, and the name of the things of which it has been compounded, and into which it will be resolved. For nothing is so productive of elevation of mind as to be able to examine methodically and truly every object which is presented to thee in life, and always to look at things so as to see at the same time what kind of universe this is, and what kind of use everything performs in it, and what value everything has with reference to the whole, and what, with reference to man, who is a citizen of the highest city, of which all other cities are like families, what each thing is, and of what it is composed, and how long it is the nature of this thing to endure." In fact, it was rereading that only today that this reference to, and it rather actually caused me to look again at value, because it, the term, what does he say? What kind of universe this is, and what kind of use everything performs in it, and what value everything has with reference to the whole. What value everything has with reference to the whole. So, having used the word value, let's explore that a little. So, in terms of, and it's a common enough word, isn't it? So one use is where Marcus Aurelius has used it here. What value everything has with reference to the whole of which it is a part. But in economics, we get concerned with two types of value. Value in use, what something is really useful for, and value in exchange, i.e., what would you exchange it for? And this becomes important, again, as we've already pointed out, because when a thing is mutually exchanged, both parties benefit. So even more value is added then. So there's a difference between something that is valued because I wish to use it and something else that is valued because I wish to exchange it. Money, for example, its value derives from the ability to exchange it for something else, not because you're going to use it to write letters on it or to make clothes out of. You're going to use it in exchange. And of course, almost everything these days is made in order to be exchanged. We few of us, if any, produce what we need ourselves, grow our own food, build our own houses, make our own clothes. It's all in order to be exchanged for something else that we value more highly from that which we produced. So that's these two types of value, value in use and value in exchange. But there are also two sources of value, where the value comes from, or why it exists, you could even say. First of all, there's value that derives from production, value that we attribute to something to the extent that we're prepared to produce it, and to the extent that we're prepared to exchange our labour in order to produce it. So it's value that derives from production. But there's another source or origin of value, and that's value that is said to derive from obligation or need. So, for example, we value the air we breathe, the water we drink, the space we occupy. And that's a value that nobody creates. So it's not a value derived from production. Its value derives from our absolute need or obligation to occupy it, to use it, to have it. And if we were being suffocated or drowning or whatever, the value that we ordinarily take for granted in breathing would suddenly become all important, and we would exert ourselves to the utmost degree in order to acquire it. But that's not a value that derives from production. It's a value that derives from need or obligation. And so, for example, again, if I was to make reference to money, for example, money, pound notes or whatever, costs hardly anything to produce. But we value it. We value it because we are obliged to, if we were going to make use of this facility of exchanging. But most important example, of course, of things that acquire a value from obligation or need, certainly in economic terms, is land. But not only land, and let's just be clear now in terms of our definitions of words. What do we mean by land in the terms of economics? Well, we mean everything that nature provides, that nature provides to all. That's in economics what's meant by land. But we can more usefully, and that's what I was looking for because I'd written it earlier, and now I can't lay my hand on it, is all that nature provides, we need because we're obliged to use it. Now, when, as I've already mentioned, two or more people wish to occupy part of the same thing at the same time, this phenomenon of rent arises. In the ordinary way, and I don't know, some of you might have been watching earlier, yesterday I think it was, one of Richard Attenborough's programs, or well, I think it was Richard Attenborough one, about lions or pumas, I think it was, in South America, and seeing their territorial nature. And the way, of course, they settle as to who's going to occupy the best site is they fight for it. And traditionally, of course, in the UK and worldwide, human beings have fought each other in order to take possession of the best locations. But that fighting doesn't lead to the realization of the full potential of what human beings are. So a mark of a civilized, settled society is that we don't fight for possession of land anymore, but there is a need to recognize an obligation that those that are denied a particular location are compensated by those that are privileged to enjoy a particular location. And a point that's worth marking here in relation to land is that the security of tenure that is vital to exclusive occupation is only possible if it is guaranteed by the rest of the community and by the government that provides that security of tenure, that defends it. So it's very difficult to deny that there must be an obligation of those that enjoy the best locations. And therein lies the clue, really, to, well, where might public wealth, public revenue come from? The economic crime that most of us are familiar with is theft. If you've ever had something taken from you or stolen from you, you will be aware of the sense of injustice that comes with that. Now, that's why a primary crime that is committed daily on all of us is that what we own, what we have worked, what we have produced is taken from us by our government. It comes in the form of taxes levied on employment, levied on trade and exchange. So I suppose what that really brings us back to is what's the true basis of legitimate property? How would we decide whether something can truly be mine as distinct from ours or as distinct from everyone's? What would be the basis of just property? George's answer is, did you make it? Were your own efforts responsible for producing it? If you made it, then it is legitimately yours rather than anyone else's. If you did not make it, it's property, it's proper, but it should stay with the person that did make it, that did produce it. So it's a producer thing. The link between production and possession is a key idea, another key idea, if you like. But if you abandon that, what other basis will you have for possession, for property, other than violence, other than, well, I've taken it? Or you might say, I got there first, or whatever, I picked it. But in relation to space, for example, then it really rather matters as to what the basis is that you should enjoy it, or any individual should enjoy it, to the exclusion of all others. And so herein is the plea, if you like, for justice. What's the basis of property? What's proper about property? Anything other than having received it as a gift, but it has to be a gift from someone who exercised or had a legitimate right to it in the first place. So it's no consolation to have received a slave, for example, from somebody that paid good money for a slave. It's actually no consolation to receive a piece of the earth for somebody that paid good money for it. If it was stolen, then it's still illegitimate. But the thing I was really coming to here was what we see in community is a need for public revenue. And so there's a correspondence between this need for public revenue on the one hand and a source of public revenue or of common value on the other. And that source derives from the permission and protections that the community as a whole and its government give to individuals for exclusive enjoyment of a particular part of nature. Now, I've used land, meaning terra firma for the most part, but I could have equally referred to the capacity of the earth to absorb carbon dioxide, a gift of nature. What right has anyone to consume that capacity to the exclusion of others without compensating others? But coming more even closer to home, we could say electromagnetic wavelengths. You know, we're all utterly dependent upon the internet these days. And yet it can be, but who is enjoying the revenue from that? And to some extent we are. I suppose what I'd quite like to go is just drawing a little bit on my own personal experience. Peter mentioned that my professional life was devoted to the provision of public water services, public water supplies, sewage and sanitation and river management. But in particular, let me just stay with water, public water supplies for a start. And much of my professional career was spent in India and Africa, where there's not enough water. There's water shortage. And so the challenge there was, how do you ensure that everybody gets a basic water supply before anyone gets a luxury supply? Because it's the self-same thing. The water, this is one of the beauties of water, is that it's the same commodity that is a matter of life and death for everyone, but is a matter of the height of luxury for some. And if some are able to commandeer, possess more water than is absolutely necessary for their basic needs, while others are denied their basic needs, then there's a problem. In the event, I was able to devise a system by which you could ensure that everybody got a basic supply before anyone got an abundant supply. And it worked a bit like this, and I do see a parallel here. In ordinary terms, we think in terms of 40 litres per head per day as a person's basic needs for sanitary and health purposes. So a household of 5 people would need 200 litres per day. And I devised a system which enabled that to happen, a drip irrigation system. I'll go into just, if you'll excuse me, because it does illustrate a point. The way in which the orthodox approach to sharing water is water meters. But under the circumstances that I've described where there's not enough water to go round, water is intermittently supplied. So in most villages and cities and in the places that I worked, water was only online for 2 or 3 hours a day. It was off for the rest of the time. Now, under those circumstances, water meters don't work. They either are measuring air or they're running backwards. So you've got a system by which you didn't have a mechanism for paying for water that was equitable. In fact, what it led to was awful corruption. So, for example, one of the best jobs you could have in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, where I worked for some time, was to be a water meter reader, because it was a fiction, a complete fiction as to what the water meter reading was. So better to be the water meter reader's boss, of course. But what I'm really just trying to point out to you is that a failure to organise the system of sharing this vital commodity led to corruption and enabled enormous corruption and miscreant behaviour. But what I fathomed in terms of my system, and I was using drip irrigation technology to provide this, what you needed to do was, with an intermittent supply, you're bound to be taking your water from a storage tank. And the storage tank, as I've pointed out, was being filled or partly filled 2 hours every day. What you needed to do was to drip feed it and feed it 24 hours a day. But having done that, now within a population of 1,000, let's say, for example, I can provide everybody with a basic supply. But I could also now provide, let's say, 100 households with a 2-star supply, and 50 households with a 3-star supply, and let's say 20 households with a 4-star supply, and maybe 5 households with a 5-star supply. What am I bid? Now I can discover what's the value of the water. And now it is precious. And what I'm bid, of course, as now those that are able are bidding against each other, is that there's more than enough collected to pay for all the water, not just the supply of it, so that all those with a basic need can have it for nothing. The basic supply is available free of charge. It's fully paid for, all the costs and more is paid for through the 2, 3, 4, 5-star service, i.e. over and above what is the margin. And many of you will be familiar with the idea that at the margin, land is free. All I was doing in relation to water supplies was saying, at the margin, water is free. But at supramarginal locations, or in my case, supramarginal amounts, you pay. And because you're bidding against each other, you raise more than enough money to pay for the service. And the parallel that I would see in relation to the economy of the country, and I could go on to illustrate that, is more than enough if you collect the land rent rather than steal from people's earnings and people's trading. That'll probably do for now. Any questions, observations or comments while I try and grab a glass of water? I can go into as the question as to what would be the impact, because that's where I would be leading to, the impact of abolishing what I've called theft, income tax levied on ordinary people. I'm not talking now about income tax or taxes being levied on those of salaries of 200 or 300 or 400 or 500,000 pounds a year. That's not generally a reward for working. That's generally a monopoly revenue of some sort. But the impact of income tax, VAT and national insurance all reduce the effective level of earnings and increase the cost of employment for every employer. So the abolition of those taxes, income tax, VAT, national insurance contributions for employer and employee, would reduce the employment costs and thus the purchase price, or the free market purchase price, of every commodity, every good and service that's produced by labour. And that's all of it. Questions, observations, comments, or if you want me to elaborate further, I shall, but I suspect we should try and deal with some of the principle or the points that I've made in the first instance, rather than get down to the individual numbers. Yes, Brian.
How can we link this back to philosophy? Because the problem with economics is that the word economics turns people off. And of course, what you've described is very clearly the natural law. How can that be, as it were, expressed to somebody who's studying philosophy?
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Brian, because I did actually miss out the key point, didn't I, of actually drawing the parallel. Well, what we've discovered, haven't we, with our philosophy, is that the impediment to realizing who we truly are is a mistake, a mistaken identity, as we mistake our bodies and our minds and the various roles and parts that we play as ourselves. And so we substitute a mistaken idea of the parts that we play as if they are ourselves, when our philosophy teaches us ourselves are one and we are one with the universe. So it's a mistaken claim is as it were at the root of our philosophical dilemma of discovering what I am. And in the same token, the route to economic injustice is again a mistaken claim, a claim to that which is provided freely by nature and which by its nature cannot be owned. And so it's, I mean, I alluded to it, but probably not clear enough when I said, what's the basis of property? The basis of property is, did you make it? The basis of property is not, do you claim it? So it's this propensity to claim that is the common dis-ease, as it were, that frustrates the economist and the philosopher. That's the idea, Brian. I don't know if that makes any sense, or if it would be helpful to elaborate or on that. But that's really where I'm coming from, is this recognition that it's the same impediment that blocks our realization of our true nature and that blocks our route to economic justice is a claim, an ahankaric claim as to what's mine, if you like.
Yes, thank you very much. That's very useful.
Thank you. Alan.
David, thank you for that talk. That's very good. I tend to come at this from a sort of very practical angle, and that is, if you were to end income tax and replace it with some sort of economic rent system, what would be a set of practical steps that would take you from one position to the other? How could you sell it?
Well, the practical step in relation income tax is progressively raise the threshold upon which it starts to operate. So at the present time, it operates at £12,000 or 12,500, is it, a year, is tax-free. I would be looking to raise that threshold to £100,000 per year, tax-free, as it were. So that would be the step. Now, what would be the effect of that? To raise that would be to increase the take-home pay for everyone, yeah. And by the same token, if and I'm going to abolish national insurance, let's say employees contribution, that would reduce the cost of employment to every employer. So employers win, wage earners win. There's more money now in the private sector of the economy. There's slightly less money, or significantly less money, in the public sector. The revenue's gone down. But where does this extra money go that has now gone into the private sector? And if you look at national statistics, you'll see that something like 18% of the gross domestic product is currently paid in property rent. Some fraction of that, let's say half, is attributable to the building, and another fraction is attributable to the value of the site. Generally speaking, it's around 50-50, it would appear, nationwide these days. But if we now start, we now recognise people have now got lots more money in their pocket because they're not being taxed on their earnings. Where are they going to spend it? Well, they're going to, much of it is going, well, again, because we've now reduced employment costs, we've reduced the price of certain goods and services that those employments are currently producing. So they can still acquire everything that they used to acquire before the change, but now they've got more money in their pocket. And as a general rule, people seek to occupy the best sites they can afford. Now, most of us live in houses that when we first moved into them, that was the best we could get. That was what we could afford. So now, and I'm translating now not capital value into, but the rental value of houses, let's say. Now, the price of houses goes up. But in fact, it's not the price of the house, it's the price of the land. Because indeed, now I've reduced with income tax and national insurance reductions, I've now reduced the cost of building. So building costs have come down, and as a proportion, my 50% might now be 60 or 70% land and 30% building because of that. So there's a progressive nature there in terms of increasing the lot. By the same token, of course, as I have increased the ability or the take-home pay of every employer, the need for secondary benefits and the like that are needed reduces. So the need for public revenue is now reduced as the opportunity has expanded. And if you start doing some sums on that, which I have done, you begin to see that with a significant reduction now in public expenditure and an increase in private expenditure, the net result is an increase in land values, which I'm now going to collect as a source of revenue. It's just worth noting here in passing, I guess, the nature of land value in terms of its capital value. And of course, it only acquires, I say of course, because not everybody recognises it, but the capital value of land, of a site, is currently based upon an estimate of a discounted future stream of rents. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's a guess. It's an imaginary number. It's taking us out of reality. But because we do not collect the rental value of land for the whole community, it must go to individuals. And when it goes to individuals, it first of all acquires a capital value, and then it acquires a speculative capital value. So it's inflated still further in that way. Now, what does that give rise to? That gives rise now to impacts upon the monetary system, as new money is brought into existence in order to pay the mortgages against a capital value of land. Mm-hmm. So there are no shortages of interests in preserving the status quo. But that will be the step. But the big thing that I think really matters here is the abolishment or the minimisation of unjust taxes. And I'm putting income tax, national insurance and VAT as essentially inherently unjust because they don't respect private property. There's a mistake idea about private property.
And then how do you go on and practically capture the increase in the value of land and use that revenue for public services?
Well, in terms of practical politics, my own ideas in this context would be we've got to link this now with a review of business rates and council tax, both of which need to be based on land values. And this would again link now still further with a very radical reform of the public sector, so that we localize rather than centralize. So in my book, a longer term ambition is that all revenue is actually collected locally, and it's then transmitted upwards rather than collected centrally and transmitted downwards. That would be, as it were, part of the implementation aspects that I would be inclined to favour.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, David.
Anything else? Two participants have raised their hand. Yes. Yes, Mark.
I'm just trying to unmute myself. Right, I managed it.
Well done.
Is this a modern version of the single tax movement?
Yes, yes. Yeah, yes, it would be. Yeah, I don't know how modern it is, but it is a single tax. Yeah, ultimately, that's where I would be going, to a single tax. And what I'm comfortable is that a single tax would be more than sufficient.
Yeah. Now, it sounds much better than land value taxation.
Single tax. Yeah. Well, actually, I just call it rent.
Okay.
Well, let me go back. In my book, what we're collecting is resource rent.
Yes.
And the resource rent in this instance is land, but that resource could equally be the CO2 capacity of the earth, or it could be whatever natural resource it is that we're speaking about. And whereas in relation to land, yes, it can be local. In relation to CO2 emissions or whatever, it has to be global. In relation to wavelengths, it might be national. But there's a whole hierarchy here of recovering resource rents for the community, for the whole community.
Right.
Yeah, so it is a single tax, but it's a single tax levied on resources, not peculiarly terra firma.
Yeah, resource rents.
Resource
rents.
rents.
I like that, yes.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah. Can you see me?
Oh,
hello?
Yes. Yes. Is
Hello.
that Heather Sluice? I'm seeing a landscape Oh, no, I'm not. Am I seeing a?
Yes, it is a landscape. It's Uffington White Horse.
Yes, I thought it was
Oh,
a
yeah.
white horse.
Yeah.
It was the white horse.
Yes, yeah, no, sorry, I've got one of my kids with me and they don't want to be on camera. So
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Okay.
yeah, no, firstly, thank you for an incredibly inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, good.
I find it particularly interesting, your comments about cooperation and remembering the connection back to yourself and therefore your connection with the rest of humanity and nature, and how that would then reflect to further cooperation, which can only ultimately lead to justice. If everybody's cooperating, everybody's remembering that connection to nature, to themselves, to the rest of humanity, it allows easier access to fulfill the potential that the human race as a whole possesses, rather than just the individual. As you said, we all have our own skills, and it takes the cooperation of all those skills together to make things work. But if you don't have that connection and that willingness to engage with that, that's why things fall apart.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. Thank you very much for that. Did you have a question as such, or was that just a commendation? Thank you.
It was, yes, it was just a commendation, really. Yeah. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Very much appreciate that. Thank you very much for that. Anything else?
Yeah.
Yes. Where am I looking? Is that Kevin?
It is Kevin. Yeah. Thank you for your interesting and inspiring talk. Has there ever been a time and a place where these ideas have been adopted or attempted to be adopted? Or if not, how can people influence politicians to have a serious look at these ideas you've propounded tonight?
Well, comprehensively and in totality, I suspect the answer is, well, in one sense, it's no. No, it hasn't been. But in partial terms, it has been. So, for example, an example that's often quoted is Hong Kong during, and you could now say Singapore to some extent. But in the days when Hong Kong was under British control, we never owned the land, of course. So the UK government could only leasehold the land. It could only lease the land for rent. And as such, the income in Hong Kong was very high in terms of collecting the rent. And so, again, as a major trading place, it didn't want to impose taxes on trade. And so that is a partial example. There are examples in parts of America. Pennsylvania comes to mind, particularly, where certain areas there is a split tax. So there's a tax on land and a tax on buildings, and the proportions vary from that. But it's pretty minuscule and small. But I suppose if you really want an example of how this system works, but it's not exactly the same system, we have to go back to probably Anglo times, pre-conquest in the case of the UK, and look at the recognition that the Lord and the King protected the people, and the people owed duty of service to the King. So there was this reciprocation between the protection that's provided on the one hand and the rendering of a service on the other was central to the whole feudal system, as I would have understood it. And it's, of course, if we trace the history, what we got was the commutation of service rendered into a money payment. And with the money payment, the whole thing started to get corrupted again, as we then had Parliament as distinct from the King, and what, of course, we'll all probably be well aware of, all the members of Parliament were big landowners. Indeed, right? It is only 120 odd years ago, isn't it, that in order to have a vote, you needed to be a landowner. And so that whole system got corrupted from then on in the case of the UK. So you've got to go back quite a long way to see the recognition of the duty, the link, if you like, which was what I was trying to make here, the link between protection, and in this instance, protection of security of tenure, being what the government provides, and the compensation to the government being, that's the rent that you pay to the government for that protection. I'm almost saying it's a protection racket, but that isn't what I mean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. But I mean, I suppose the other thing that that I alluded to. Oh yes, sorry, I won't go there yet. Yes, Pamela. You're muted, Pamela.
What would happen to all the jobs that people do in accounting and collecting all the insurance, national insurance and so on, that they wouldn't have to do? This would worry thousands of people.
Yeah.
And it's off-putting. I have mentioned a different system to my nephew, who's in a government job, in the civil service, and the whole idea isn't attractive unless you've covered that. You have to say what would happen. Would the same number of people still keep their jobs doing a different system?
Yeah, well, they don't keep those jobs. Those jobs become redundant, as you said. I mean,
but this is the worry. There's so many people.
Yes, it is.
In public services that is not. We have to think round that.
Yes, we do. We do need to think round that. But there's no shortage of need that can only be met by labour. I mean, if you look for, but it will require, just as every change requires, a different skill set, a different attitude. But there will be absolutely, we know, there is no shortage of need. If there's a need there are jobs to be done. The challenge is, how do you organise that? And that's quite right. Obviously, that will be the case. But the simple fact, isn't it, is that wouldn't we all prefer to be wearing bespoke clothes, living in bespoke houses, travelling in artisan goods and services, rather than mass-produced, duplicated, that are being produced by people in soulless jobs? I mean, it is true, though, of course, that people become accustomed to certain modes of behaviour. So yes, there is no question there is a transition required there. But I don't think there should really be, with an intelligent application, a fear that there won't be worthwhile jobs to be done. There's no, I mean, the whole care sector, as we now know, I mean, it is crying out for care people, for people looking after each other. And certainly the craft industries, you could imagine, would be open to thrive. And for each of these, let's say they're just tax account. I mean, there's a whole tax industry, you're quite right. And they would need to, if we simplified it, they would need to find something else to do. But no, that's what coal miners had to do. That's what shipbuilders had to do. And it is difficult, but if it's intelligently handled, and after all, what do people really want? Do they really want employment, or they just want gainful activity that is satisfying, provided their material needs are being met? And so you've got to create the environment and the conditions in which people aren't prevented from working, prevented from doing what they love doing. I mean, if we look at all the hobbies that people have, I mean, that's to be able to, and in fact, it has been quite interesting, hasn't it, during this whole lockdown thing, to see how many new and innovative practices have come into being. So I don't think we should be too despondent that that's untackleable, but it is a challenge. There's no question that is a challenge. I mean, one of the things that went through my mind, it's been a bit of a hobby horse of mine, I never quite understood. I just managed to miss out on national service by a couple of years. I expect you, Brian, you probably had to do it, didn't you? Anyway, I missed out on national service, but I could never quite understand is why from the age of 18 to 21, which was when that was covering, and which we've got into the habit of trying to send as many of our 18-year-olds as we possibly can to university to study God knows what half the time, as far as I can work out. But why the whole idea of national service was confused with military service. Now, in terms of an opportunity to either learn a trade or a skill or just be of service, during a period of one's life when few 18-year-olds know what they really want to do, but the opportunity to explore in an organised fashion rendering public services strikes me as something that might be one avenue by which could be provided. But the whole retraining, restructuring, all becomes necessary, but the funds are there to do it then. If the system works, then you can afford to re-educate, retrain, re-skill people. And people would presumably love it. No reason why they shouldn't. Those self-same, I mean, one of the tragedies, for example, that I see, as Peter mentioned, I trained as an engineer. The number of engineers that come out of university these days that don't go into engineering is incredible, because they all go into finance and technology and other things that use their mathematical skills. So, but it's a skill set that you acquire that can be applied in one area, or it could be applied in another. But as I say, I mean, we've got two big industries, well, several, I suppose, but the tax industry and the finance industry, all of which produce actually very little in terms of adding value. What they're about is redistributing, but not redistributing in the fashion that we would like to approach. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything more? I suppose, having mentioned the finance industry, I could say a couple of words about money and where it goes. And just before, or at the very beginning of COVID breakdown, I went to a meeting in Bloomsburg, is it? In the city, at the Bank of England. And there I listened to a talk by the chief economist of the Bank of England, who was giving a rundown of the whole economy. And he spoke for probably 45 minutes. And Andy Haldane is his name. And at the end of it, I was struck by the fact that he never once mentioned tax. And I couldn't quite understand how it was that you could speak about the whole British economy and these 5 pillars I think he talked about without referring to the 40% of the gross national product that goes in tax. And as it happened, I missed out on being able to put a question to him in the meeting itself. But at the end of the meeting, and it was a really rather plush affair, and that I'd managed to get a ticket for, I found myself entering the lift with him at the end of the show, as it were. And it was the classic, really, you know, well, what would you do if you got 2 minutes or 30 seconds in the lift with somebody that mattered? And anyway, I just put to him, why didn't you mention tax? I just asked him, why didn't you mention tax? And he said, here at the Bank of England, he says, we don't mention tax and the Treasury don't mention money. And that's the deal. The deal is that we don't go there. And I thought, well, that's incredible, isn't it? How you could, because, they're all major players in the whole British economy, but they don't tread on each other's turf. And I then sort of went still further and just made as it happened, when we got out of the lift, there was a security thing and there was a bit of a blockage. So I had another 30 seconds or a minute, whatever it was, with him as we were waiting for the security people to clear the thing. And I just put to him the business but how can you not mention tax when most of the money for housing is on mortgages, and mortgages is the way in which you now increase the money supply? No, yeah. But, oh no, we can go now. So it's just interesting. I thought that you do not hear. I mean, all that you hear in the media, virtually, isn't it, is that more or less taxes. We don't hear how. We only hear the how big. But I could temper that slightly, and I don't know how many of you heard last week the interview with the chair of the John Lewis Partnership, Lady Sharon White, is it? I think it is, a West Indian lady. She born in West Indies. Not her grandparents were born in West Indies. She was raised in Leytonstone, a very ordinary district, poorer part of London, but she went to Cambridge. She got a good, and she worked at the Treasury, and now she works at the John Lewis Partnership as chairperson, I should say. And at the end, and it's a very, I'd thoroughly recommend it to watch it on the YouTube as or BBC iPlayer, I suppose it is. She then outlined, well, you'll all be familiar with the ethos of the John Lewis Partnership in this sense of the showing. And she was very sympathetic and extraordinarily intelligent, I thought, in terms of the responses to the online retail market and how John Lewis's have to address that. But Amal Rajan was the interviewer, and he said to her, now, if you were in Rishi Sunak, what would you do now with the upcoming budget and change? What arrangements would you change? And I nearly fell off my chair as she said, I would substitute business rates with land value taxation. And I thought that was, wow. And I thought, so, so that's why I say I would recommend you have a look at that thing, because there's an influential business person that has recognizes the error of business taxes, in this instance, taxing the buildings, not the land. I just wonder whether she could go further and realise that if retailing becomes a marginal industry, how it would be helped by not having to pay income tax, by not having the cost of all their employees being twice as much as they should be. So it's the classic, really, is that you don't tax the margin. Now, at one time, a marginal industry would have been coal mining or steel production or whatever. But now it's retail. And, we all see the evidence in the high streets now, again, of speculators holding sites out of use against the day when the capital value will go up. Because that's the only reason you hold a shop or a factory or a house out of use, is because you're not looking for revenue, you're looking for capital gain. You're looking for the capital value of the house to go up. Anything more? Looks like we might be there, Peter.
Yes, thank you, David. I have to say, regarding Pamela's question, something in me absolutely rejoices at the thought of the civil service being reduced, the treasury or the accountancy professions and so on, when there's only one tax.
I don't know how many. I'm currently with my wife settling her brother's account, who he passed away in November, and now, of course, we're into the whole debacle of death duties, inheritance tax. I mean, it's incredible. And in his case, the value of his estate is not all in his house; it's in his savings. The poor chap. It's what he earned, and now 40% of it's going to go. So he can't leave all. He's leaving his estate to his 4 nephews, two of them my sons, but the government's going to take 40% of it.
Yeah.
But it's very, very complicated. It takes a month to sort out. Well, sometimes years, of course, but it just amazes me the complications and the level of distrust. I mean, that's something that I haven't dealt with really, but I could say a few words about it if I may. There's a very fine lecture or talk that Henry George gave once. It was called The Crime of Poverty, by which he does not mean that those in poverty are criminals. He just means that they're in poverty because of the crime that is committed against them by our estate, by our national arrangements. That and to the extent that we're silent on it, we're all complicit in that crime. That if we see theft, robbery, injustice being done and stay silent, we're implicit. Sorry, Peter.
Well, that's fine. Well, thank you very much, David. Are there any final questions?
If I may.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I may be mistaken, but isn't there a cross-party group that are looking at land value capture?
Yes, there is. Yes, the all-party parliamentary group is looking at that.
What's it
Yes,
called?
it's called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Land Value Capture.
Oh, right, simple as that.
And I have made presentation to it for what
Okay.
it's worth. In fact, the Coalition for Economic Justice is the secretariat to that group, and I'm currently chair of the Coalition for Economic Justice.
All right. Okay, so there is progress.
Well, yes, slow, pathetically slow progress, but yes, there is. So it's on the agenda for some, but it certainly needs more support and needs following up. But yes, it is. There is some progress. Or yes, in fact, I think it will be fair to say, certainly within my lifetime or anything that I can remember now, yes, I'm more optimistic now than I probably have been for the last 50 years anyway.
So there are people collecting lots of information in support of it.
Yes, yes. Well, oh gosh, the situation's pretty urgent, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we've now got a generation, 20-year-olds to 40-year-olds, who can't afford to buy a family home, to get a family home.
Yeah, it is.
And it's dire.
Mm.
And put that then alongside the whole climate change crisis and the rest, to say nothing of the war of territorial gain that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. No, it's all about land.
Yeah.
It's all about possession of land, one way or another.
And ideas about land.
Sorry?
Ideas about land.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's right. And that's why, yeah, that's the power of the idea is what really matters.
Mm.
I suppose what I could do, if you like, Peter, I could maybe.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Actually,
Open another can of worms.
no, well, it's okay. I think I'll just share a diagram. Can you see that?
Yes.
No, I mean, there's nothing very novel about that, other than I've changed the labels in some of those of you that have done the thing would recognise. But it's, that's telling the story in the simplest possible fashion. There's a human factor and a non-human factor in the world. The human factor produces labour and exertion, and the non-human factor produces all the natural provisions, but they have to meet at conditions at the point of interaction. And I've put subsets there of the level of civilization, the theories, opinions and beliefs, and that's what has just been referred to, and the human laws, customs and traditions. Those are the conditions at the point of interaction, and they determine the nature of the produced world, the wealth, how it gets produced and how it gets distributed. But I thought it was quite an interesting way of simply presenting the same diagram that we've used for a long time, I think. Yeah. But I've just given slightly different labels to it now, as recognising a human factor and a non-human factor and the like. So that's it was just something that I thought might be worth sharing. And I still don't know what it was I was looking for earlier, but it doesn't matter. We've had a good time. What am I doing? No, I should be taking a screen sharing. Sorry, I'm trying to stop share now. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, David. That's a brilliant talk. As always, you exercise my mind at quite a pace to, to keep up with you. That's terrific, really great.